Hello there. I've tended to avoid talking about issues that are very contemporary, controversial, political, religious in nature, or anything like that, because I want to be able to convey the stories that I find important, and I want to address universal truths. I don't want this video to become dated in a week or a month or a year or a decade. But there are some controversies that keep coming up. And in the last couple of live streams that I've done, I have talked about how I am increasingly observing that people are disagreeing with each other and looking at the same evidence, but seeing something completely different. I believe I understand why, but now I am left facing another question. And I do not have an answer to this question. I am throwing this question out to you. You can probably tell from the thumbnail or the title of this video what that question is. And that is, what does it take to change your mind about something? Are you holding on to a belief that you refuse to let go of, even when presented with overwhelming evidence to the contrary? And I ask that because I have to ask that question of myself as well. I find myself getting into conversations with people and understand I have spent a lot of time in academia studying politics and international relations and history, both of the United States and Europe, as well as the rest of the world. My undergrad degree includes not only one degree in history, but another in Russian and Soviet studies, which is a powerful combination. So I have opinions about the way politics shape. And yet, when I am talking with people, it seems to me sometimes, no matter how you frame the information, they can't hear it. And you find it impossible to get them to even recognize that there can be an opposing viewpoint that makes any sense. But then I take that 2 steps further. One step is there something that I am holding on to, some belief that I hold dear, that I am not seeing that there's an opposing point of view that might actually have some validity? And beyond that, to what extent does it matter if I can't be convinced when I'm wrong, or you can't be convinced when you are wrong? I could give plenty of examples of where I have run into this, but I think as a general rule, it's most instructive when I present a case where I feel like I'm the one in the hot seat, so that first of all, I don't touch the third rail with any of you, because I want your honest feedback about this particular issue. So I will tell you a quick story about a time when I was having lunch with a friend of mine at a wonderful pizzeria in downtown Redmond, Washington, which is in the northwestern corner of the United States. It was a beautiful sunny day, and we were just two old colleagues sitting at a table enjoying some of the most amazing pizza that can be had in America's Pacific Northwest. And this is a friend of mine from our journalism days when we were both working at a weekly news feature magazine. And he is very well educated and blazingly brilliant. I am very well educated, and I would like to think that I'm not a slouch myself when it comes to thinking through a problem. And that said, he nonetheless tended to believe in or give stock to conspiracy theories that I tended to view with more skepticism. And he brought up as an example, while we were talking over a lovely meal, Inris, what would it take to convince you that FDR, President of the United States, knew that the Japanese were about to attack Pearl Harbor and he let it happen? What would it take for me to convince you that he knew and he let it happen? And I thought about it. And I gave an answer that clearly bothered me because I remember it now. We had this conversation uh, uh, when when I was in my mid 20s. This conversation was somewhere 25, 30 years ago. And he posed this question, and my answer to him at the time was, I don't think you could. I don't think you could convince me that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew that there was going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor and he let it happen because he wanted the United States to go to war. And the only way to make that happen was if the United States was attacked from one of the belligerent nations. It bothered me for a long time, and I realized why eventually. And what I realized was I had worded my response incorrectly. I know that I can be convinced that this is the case, but it would take a lot more evidence than I believe is possible because I have studied the question so thoroughly. I have read so much, I have listened to so many lectures, I have seen so many artifacts that have made it clear to me that whatever President FDR's failings were at the time, he could not, would not, and did not allow this to happen, let alone under some delusional belief that this was going to bring the US into war, because there's no reason to believe that that would have worked. And if you had allowed the nation to be attacked by a foreign country, you would be in some pretty hot water with the American public if that were ever found out. So, but that's an emotional argument, or maybe not an emotional argument, but it is a very, very soft logical argument to make. I'm appealing to common sense when I say that. But when I look at the evidence, when I know what I know about what FDR knew, I am convinced with the evidence that is available that no, he didn't let it happen. There are a lot of reasons why people suggest that this is the case, that he let it happen, that he knew about it, and my friend presented a smoking gun. He said, we know, and by the way, this is absolutely true. We know that President FDR did receive in a briefing just before the attack happened, like the day before the attack happened, that the attack was imminent and the Japanese were going to aim at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And we know this to be true. And that makes it sound pretty compelling, doesn't it? That, well, all right, he had it in a briefing. He knew it was coming. Why didn't he just pick up the phone and alert the Navy at Pearl Harbor that they needed to scatter the ships? By the way, there are a lot of circumstantial reasons why we come to why historians have come to the conclusion that there's no way FDR could have known. No, there's no way that FDR could have known and willingly not acted, including, among other things, the fact that half of the fleet wasn't even in the port at the time, which implies it implies a lot of things. The point is, this is the smoking gun that is often presented as the definitive nail in the coffin, even after all of the other objections have been addressed. And I knew the response, and it's the same response that actually levels a lot of conspiracy theories. Uh, a lot of conspiracy theories start with, well, look who benefited, as if the conspiracy unfolded the way it was supposed to, and it benefited the people it was supposed to, and therefore those people must have been the ones who committed it. There are conspiracies. Conspiracies absolutely happen all the time. They often, or there are many cases where we can demonstrate, here's a conspiracy, here's a bunch of people who have acted together in concert to benefit themselves. This has absolutely happened in the past. However, that sort of collusion does leave trails of evidence that are much clearer, much more obvious to be true. This one is a topic that has elicited a lot of passion and a lot of emotion that gets brought into the argument, and we want to look at it strictly from the standpoint of logic and evidence. And in this particular case, the reason that evidence doesn't hold up is because we also know, historians who have actually looked at the record, you don't just look at the briefing that the president got the day before or the day of. You have to look at the briefings throughout the entire episode. And you discover that very early on, the United States became concerned that Japan was going to launch an attack on America's West Coast. And we were receiving credible evidence daily that the Japanese were going to attack on this day and they were going to attack this target. The thing is, it was a different target every day. Usually it was 2 or 3 targets. If I remember correctly, and I may not, the briefing for December 7th might have even indicated it was either going to be Pearl Harbor or San Francisco, which are very different targets. But yeah, the president had that notice, but the president also had the notice that it was going to happen the day before somewhere else, that it was going to be Seattle the day before that, or it was going to be Los Angeles, or it was going to be San Francisco, or it was going to be Portland, Oregon. Every day there were new targets that were being mentioned, and there was reason to believe that this time it was actually going to be true. Obviously, on December 7th, we know in hindsight, it turned out that it was true. But people want to believe what they want to believe when it shores up the belief system that underpins their understanding of how the world works. So I've looked at a lot of evidence. I've come to the conclusion that I have. The thing is, if I'm going to be intellectually honest, and if I'm going to have an understanding of how the world works, I have to be open to the possibility that the evidence that I have is incomplete, that there may be evidence out there that is even more compelling, that in fact, FDR did know that this was actually going to be the attack that happened, and that he willfully went back on everything he had ever said in private or in public, anything that he had ever done that revealed his character. He willfully went back on all of that in order to allow this to happen, because he knew for a reasonable certainty that he was going to get an outcome that he wanted. It's entirely possible that that evidence exists. And I have to be open to letting it persuade me when it comes in. I remember when I was in high school, I had a history, I was going to say professor, a history teacher who introduced a word to us that I always thought I knew what it meant, but he actually gave us the definition. And the word is dogma. I had always associated dogma with the idea of, oh, it's religious, it's the core religious beliefs of a religion. Nope, that's not it at all. Although it is often associated with religion, it is not exclusive to religion. Dogma is any belief that cannot be falsified. There is no argument that can be made that will disprove the belief. Now, it's very hard to prove a negative. It's very hard, and there are a number of examples that are brought up in philosophy and in science to explain this idea. Where there's Richard Dawkins has mentioned the idea that the Earth orbits around the sun, and exactly on the other side of the sun, on the Earth's orbit, there is a teacup. And that teacup is traveling along the same orbit as the Earth at the same speed as the Earth. And we will never be able to see it because it's always on the other side of the sun from us. We have never sent we've never sent out any sort of a spacecraft that would be able to get to that part of our orbit and then report back to us that, hey, there's a teacup here. You can't prove it's not there. That doesn't mean there's a teacup there. Just because you can't prove a negative doesn't mean, therefore, it must actually be true. There are sometimes ways that you can prove that it is not possible for that negative to be true. But in general, the burden of proof lies with the person who's making the assertion. So in this particular case, the burden of proof would lie with the person who makes the claim that FDR knew about the attack and allowed it to happen. If I'm the one who makes the claim, there's no way FDR knew that it was coming. Well, then, since I've made the claim, now I have to be the one to the burden of proof is on me. I have to offer evidence to back up my claim. And in this particular case, there's plenty of evidence that he didn't actually know that this attack was going to happen when it did. Again, very hard to disprove a negative, but the burden of proof is on whoever challenges the existing understanding. This is true in all matters. But we get back to my conversation with my friend over pizza at a pizzeria that no longer exists except in our memories. That when I said, I don't think you could convince me, what I absolutely meant and should have said was, you would need more evidence that is more compelling than the evidence I have seen. Now, this is relevant to a lot of what's happening in the world right now, and that includes the United States, but it also includes the United Kingdom, it includes Europe, it includes Russia and Ukraine. And I mention these as being contemporary examples of where we are seeing this, but we see this throughout history, where individuals will disagree with each other, even when they're looking at the same evidence. They will come away with completely different conclusions. So then there's the follow-up question, and that is, so what? What if I can't convince my friend that FDR did not willingly allow Japan to attack the naval fleet for the United States at Pearl Harbor? What if he is wrong for the rest of his life about that? What if he is also wrong about other conspiracy theories that suffer from the same problems when you inspect them closely, just like that conspiracy theory? So what? And the reason I ask is because the reason I am struggling with this question is because I need to decide for myself, to what extent is it worth what I jeopardize by going out on a limb and making the good faith effort to try to persuade people who are very stubborn or very much insisting upon sticking with the beliefs that they have, when I believe I have compelling evidence to override it. Because you can risk alienating people. not just the people you're trying to convince, but also the people around you. If I post something on one of the social media platforms that is echoing a sentiment that I agree with, but that other people disagree with, logic can often go out the window, and there can be flame wars online. There can be doxing, which is where people find out, oh, okay, I'm going to use what I know about the internet to find out where this person lives, where this person works. I'm going to try to get this person fired. I'm going to try to incite violence against this person. We see this happen. We read about this happening in the press. So, to what extent is it worth it for me to potentially put myself at risk? How far am I willing to go to try to make the good faith effort? And at the same time, how open am I to being the one who's wrong? And what what difference does it make? Because in the case of the friend of mine, my former editor, when we were having that slice of pizza and enjoying each other's company, and this is, you have a deep friendship when you can disagree so fundamentally on things and continue the conversation for decades. He's a very dear friend of mine, and I still really respect his mind. He is absolutely undeniably brilliant, and at the same time, he and I are absolutely convinced we are arriving at different conclusions when presented with evidence about certain topics. What if I do convince him? I go through all of the potential, I expose myself to all of the potential harm. I take the risks and finally find a way to compellingly convince him not only the error of his ways in this particular case, but in other similar cases. What's the benefit? Maybe I change how he votes. Maybe changing how he votes makes a difference in an election. These are arguments that are hard to make. I think that in some cases it might be justifiable. You might say, okay, it's not about changing how he votes, it's about changing how someone else decides whether or not to recruit people to participate in an organization that takes action on the basis of political beliefs. And there are both official and unofficial organizations that do this. The most obvious official one being the military. But there are other government organizations, there are non-governmental organizations. There's in the United States, there was for a long time a vigilante group called the Guardian Angels, who did not necessarily always act on the best of information. If I'm able to persuade somebody to take action when I think action should be taken, or to not take action when I think action should not be taken, to what extent is the risk justified to make that good faith effort? I'm throwing that question out there to all of you. And I do that because I believe that there are some topics right now that are being discussed more from a place of emotion than they are being discussed from a place of calm logic and reason and compassion. And I think it's important to have all of those things. And I think it is important sometimes to meet in the middle on certain principles if it means being owing fealty and following through on your loyalty to other more important implications, more important issues at hand. So I throw that out there. How much should we try? And how open are we to being wrong? You, my wonderful, wonderful viewer, is there anything that you're holding on to that nobody could ever convince you, no matter what? And is that appropriate? And what's the harm if you continue to cling to that belief? That's my question for the day. Thank you very much for listening to my story and my question. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you again. Please put your comments in the comment section, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks.